Genocide is defined as the deliberate killing of a large number of people from a particular nation or ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation or group. The first example to come to mind is likely the Holocaust, which saw the systematic decimation of the Jewish people and at least 6 million Jewish deaths. The Soviet Union's Holodomor, or Great Famine, created 2.4 to 7.5 million deaths due to famine. Cambodia saw an estimated 1.5 to 2 million deaths of its own people under the Khmer Rouge. And of course, there are more. The Romanian, Rwandan, Greek genocides all were atrocities which found the populations of various groups decimated by man-made reasons. Genocide is a tragedy of massive proportions that has long-lasting repercussions. It lingers in the blood, the trauma passed down like an heirloom through the generations. As a result, this is not a topic to take lightly, and yet you'll often find trans people arguing that they too are facing a genocide. Never mind that the American trans population is only about 0.8% of the population, or 1.6 million Americans. Never mind that there is a higher chance of being murdered as a woman than as a trans person. In 2021, there were an estimated 1.4 million trans people in the U.S. and 57 murders, a rate of 0.004%. There were 357 trans homicides globally, which is still only 0.03% of the U.S. trans population alone. It's important to note that even in those cases where trans people are murdered, it is by men. Not typically, always, by men. And yet, the onus of blame is placed on women. There is no basis for a trans genocide. In fact, it is insulting to pretend that there is, especially given that survivors of various genocides are still alive today, in dealing with the aftermath of those experiences. This comes hand in hand with the presentation of victimhood as being inherently virtuous, as if suffering is a way to ensure good morality and safety from a culture which prefers cancellation over growth. In the words of Edward W. Said in The Politics of Knowledge, victimhood, alas, does not guarantee or necessarily enable an enhanced sense of humanity. To testify to a history of oppression is necessary, but it is not sufficient unless that history is redirected into an intellectual process and universalized to include all sufferers. Yet too often testimony to oppression becomes only a justification for further cruelty and inhumanity, or for high-sounding cant and merely correct attitudes. The fantasy of victimization is one that prevents honest discussion of the demands placed by trans individuals. Leroy Thomas, the communications director at the National Center for Transgender Equality, said in a statement to the Washington Post, "Language shapes our understanding of the world. During a time when some political leaders are trying to erase transgender people from society, it becomes important that we are recognized as our true selves. Of course, nothing is said of a world that attempts to erase women, that has seen the oppression of women denied and twisted into the definition of the female sex itself. By redefining women to now include an adult who lives and identifies as female, though they may have been said to have a different sex at birth, the Cambridge Dictionary aims to be more inclusive, but instead obfuscates the way that women discuss and depict their oppression. Claiming that one can impress their self-image as a truth to be upheld and supported by others, simply because they state that it is true, is not a human right, nor is it a symptom of an oppressed class. In fact, much of how trans ideology acts aligns with Umberto Eco's 14 traits of fascism. Number 1. The cult of tradition. One has only to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi gnosis was nourished by traditionalist, syncretic, occult elements. In the modern trans rights movement, one can see homophobia just the same as what has historically been used in conservative talking points. Instead of saying that you should date the opposite sex, the argument is that you should date based on gender, a category which has now been expanded to include anyone who wants to identify as male, female, or something else. No longer can you be same-sex attracted. No, same-sex attraction is positioned once again as a fetish, as if sex is irrelevant, and gender, which gender ideology positions as an undefinable feeling, should denote who you are attracted to. Never mind if you are a lesbian and you are not interested in dating a man identifying as a woman. Saying that you are incapable of attraction is now bigoted, transphobic, and wrong. How is this any different than believing that lesbians only need to meet the right man to straighten out? How is this any different from conversion therapy rhetoric, which tries to convince gay men that a masculine woman, or lesbian women that feminine men, are good enough replacements for those we are actually attracted to? The tradition of misogyny continues here as well, as male desires are constantly upheld over female desires, even when the labels are changed. Take, for example, how discussion of trans women overshadows trans men or female non-binary people. Every discussion of transgenderism centers around males. For feminism, this stems from the dangers that males present when allowed in our few single-sex spaces. Within liberalism, it reveals the continued trend of men's desires overshadowing all else, except this time dressed up with different and progressive-sounding words. Number 2. The rejection of modernism. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, Ur-Fascism can be defined as irrationalism. Postmodernism is a great example of the rejection of the modern, regardless of its namesake. Postmodernism rejects much of what was considered common knowledge in the name of questioning everything and believing in nothing. As a result, quantifiable experiences, such as female oppression, are ignored and seen as a matter of perspective. It calls to question the very basis of our current society by asserting that our cultural norms are a product of the ideology of the dominant group and their interests. Those who ascribe to postmodernist views tend to believe 1. There is no objective reality. 2. There is no scientific or historical truth. 3. Science and technology, and even reason and logic, are not vehicles of human progress, but suspect instruments of established power. 4. Reason and logic are not universally valid. 5. There is no such thing as human nature. 6. Language does not refer to a reality outside itself. 7. There is no certain knowledge. And 8. No general theory of the natural or social world can be valid or true. If you were interested in learning more about postmodernism, I've already done a video on the topic, which will be linked in the description below. Number 3. The cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. In other words, why are TERFs so hated? Why do so few bother to spell out the abbreviation to note the radical feminist part of the phrase? Despite not a single feminist, let alone a single woman, being to blame for the death of a trans person, despite the myriad of sexual and violent threats being sent to feminists, despite having won the right to consider disagreement to be hate speech, trans rights activists and gender ideologists repeat their mantras, send their hate, and rarely bother to think about why so many women might be uncomfortable with the direction they're leading liberalism into. It is easier to pretend that there is a hate group of women who dislike trans people and gender nonconforming individuals for no reason besides inherent bigotry than to admit that women are oppressed by men and that to be forced to share spaces is to present danger to women. It is easier to pretend that allowing the definition of woman to be warped to include the opposite sex is not dehumanizing and misogynistic to those who have experienced womanhood as a part of life instead of as a cosplay of feminine stereotypes than to critically think about how that might affect the lives of women. Born women, and not those who wish to opt into the experience, as if it were a club to join. Number 4. Disagreement is treason. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. Anyone who disagrees, no matter how mild, with the tenets of gender ideology is branded treasonous. Be it detransitioners who question the medical treatments that were led into under the advice of medical professionals and an enthusiastic community, or merely women who assert that their sex is not a choice or a feeling. Any who disagree are told to repeat the mantra, or else are targets of abuse and violent threats. Number 5. Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, Ur-Fascism is racist by definition. Racism is a common theme in gender ideology, as they compare black women in particular as being women like trans women are women. In other words, they position black women as being the same as men. They compare segregation as being the same as sex-based separation, as if black people serve the same danger to white people on account of their race that men pose to women. They say this as if sex-segregated spaces have not been around since antiquity, as if there is no quantifiable measure that shows that 98% of rapes are committed by men, and 80% of those are against women. Number 6. Appeal to social frustration. One of the most typical features of historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from an economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation, and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. The explosion of females identifying as trans or non-binary as a result of the rising misogyny in the world around them illustrates a social frustration that few can accurately name. How can you when class consciousness has been all but destroyed, and the idea of identifying your oppressors is seen as a bigoted action, particularly as they now can opt out of the oppressing class by claiming to be another gender? We now live in a world where prostitution is sex work, where personal choice negates how outside forces have influenced you, and of course, where you can never complain about it. It should be no surprise, then, that girls are choosing to dive deeper into sexualization and femininity, which is seen as the pinnacle of womanhood, or else to reject womanhood altogether by trying to identify as something the patriarchy views as a person. Number 7. The obsession with plot. Thus, at the root of the Ur-Fascist psychology, there is the obsession with plot, possibly an international one. The followers must feel besieged. The feeling of victimization is an integral part of gender ideology. By positioning themselves as being an oppressed group targeted by the heteronormative population, by radical feminists and conservatives alike, there is a feeling of victimhood, which fuels the group loyalty and suspicion shifted between them. Anyone could be secretly transphobic. Anyone could have turfy thoughts. Anyone could be against you, and so questioning each other's every thought, forcing continual recitation of the approved thoughts, and seeking out secret disapproval is not only encouraged, but required. Number 8. The enemy is both strong and weak. By a continuous shifting of the rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. TERFs and transphobes are a minority and yet are to blame for the immense pressure that trans people are placed under to conform. TERFs and transphobes are easily frightened off with threats and violence, but pose a threat to trans people around the globe. We can ignore TERFs. They're a small hate group that can do no harm. We can't ignore TERFs. They're to blame for millions of trans deaths. All of these are rhetoric passed around the trans community, and both are held as simultaneously true. Number 9. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. For Ur-Fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather, life is lived for struggle. If one does not denounce or support of figures deemed transphobic and constantly announce their allegiance, then they are the enemy. They secretly believe in the unapproved thoughts, and silence means that you tacitly agree. Number 10. Contempt for the weak. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology. Those who engage in gender ideology often use word salad to sound smarter than they actually are. The harder it is to parse what they mean, the more intelligent they sound. After all, if you can't understand, then you can't argue. Number 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. In Ur-Fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. To call out those who disagree with you, to bully, harass, and threaten is not evil behavior, but heroic support of gender ideology. Number 12. Machismo and Weaponry. Machismo implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Actual homosexuality, as in same-sex attraction, is demonized, treated as bigoted, and often presented as being no different than sexual deviation. Women, in turn, face misogynistic and violent threats despite a denial of women as an existing category. Number 13. Selective Populism. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. Those who identify as women now speak for them. We are represented by a chosen few who now speak on behalf of anyone they consider to be part of their queer umbrella. Number 14. Ur-Fascism speaks Newspeak. All of the Nazi or fascist schoolbooks made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. As in, gender is a construct, gender identity is innate, sex and gender are different, sexuality was always based on gender. Trans people need surgery and hormones that passes the right gender. Anybody can be male or female because gender and sex are a construct, but gender is innate and no one can tell somebody's sex or gender by looking. Men and vagina owners. There is no such thing as male or female. Male and female brains exist. Gender is not binary. You are either transmisogyny exempt or affected. Consent cannot be coerced, and all labor is coerced under capitalism, but paying for sex is not coercion. Anyone can have a period. Talking about periods is hurtful because some people can't have periods. Getting nudes from another woman is cheating. Men using OnlyFans is not cheating. Liberals are not homophobic. Liberals call sexual orientation genital preferences. You can date whoever you want, but your dating preferences are exclusionary. No one is saying lesbians have to like dick. Lesbians who don't like dick make transbians unsafe. Consent has to be freely given. You can pay someone so they will have sex with you. Gender is not binary. The binary/non-binary binary. Trans people are people who transition from their assigned sex at birth to another gender. You don't have to transition to be trans. Sex and gender are different. Trans women are female, trans men are male. Abortion is not just a woman's issue. Rich women will always be able to get abortions. Not all radical feminism is trans-exclusionary. Radfem equals TERF. All radfems are Christian, conservative, heterosexual, gender-conforming women. All radfems are radical, gender-nonconforming, man-hating lesbians. How can we candidly discuss our experiences when the words we use are being continually changed to include our oppressors? When woman is now a feeling instead of a material reality, it becomes difficult to maintain that our experiences are an experienced, measurable thing, or that we are in need of protection as a result of our oppression. However, bringing up these points is often painted as playing a role in trans genocide. Trans ideology now presents only self-identification as being needed to identify as trans. No surgeries, hormones, or physical changes required. And yet, any request to further legislate access to hormones or surgeries is denoted as playing into trans genocide. To be clear, they are equating criticism to genocide. Asking questions and thinking critically as to how their demands might affect others, namely women, children, and gay people, is equated to the systematic murder and erasure of a group of people. Trans people are in no danger of erasure. Trans people are in no danger of systemic murder. Trans people are a privileged group in that they are able to dictate the reality they want, and have convinced many that not going along with their request is the same thing as aligning themselves with the Nazis. Gender ideology has more in common with fascism than radical feminism ever has or ever will. To pretend that a group that overlaps with all 14 measures of fascism is at risk of genocide is not just tone deaf, it's actively harmful to those of us they choose to blame for their false victimization. This, dear viewers, is where we part. As you can probably hear, I'm a little bit sick. That's what happens when you come from 90-degree weather to winter. But overall, I'm doing all right. I found a place to stay. I've got some work lined up, and I wanted to thank you all sincerely for those of you who offered financial support, because sincerely, I wouldn't have made it without your help. I was sitting there in the airport, unable to buy food for 2 days or stay in a hotel because my account was empty, and you guys really helped and made a difference for me. I like to think of this channel as not just me talking into the void, but, I reply to every comment. I like to think that we're a group that interacts with each other. And I wanted to just say my thanks. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate, I don't want to overstate anything, but it's nice knowing that I have support out there, and that there are people out there who, are looking out for me. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below. I do have Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee running. And with the Patreon, you can vote on future videos, get your name listed at the end of the thing, which I promise will look more professional eventually, as well as suggest video topics that are upcoming. So yeah, if you guys are interested in that, the links will be in the description, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.